My name is Finnigan, and I'm an education policy researcher. So for decades, we've been focused on schools that are failing and using our educational policies to try to address this problem. But I think we haven't seen a lot of success in this area. And part of that has to do with the fact that we've been focusing on what we need to do without thinking about how to make change happen. With the Every Student Succeeds Act, we actually have an opportunity to start to think differently about school failure and to redirect our policies in that direction. How many of you know the story of Porton the Elephant? Okay, good. Some of you do. For those of you who don't, Horton found what he thought was a little pink flower, and he was kind of happy about this because Horton was a little simple, and he was pleased by the idea of this small little thing. But then he was thinking and thinking and listening and found that there was actually a whole world in this flower. There were people and places. There was a community called Whoville. He had no idea this existed. But the reason why I bring that up is because I think in educational policy, we've been paying attention to sort of simple solutions without understanding the complexity or the layers of the educational system that need to be attended to. And why that's important is because we have layers that really need to be addressed through policy to bring about change. So the first system I'll talk about today is the system of educators. On the left, you see a slide of people connected to each other. And that's because in my work, I use social network analysis. And this allows you to look at the underlying relationships among people. And why this is important is because when you need complex change to happen, you need connections among people in an organization or in a system. And those connections need to be trusting, collaborative, reciprocal. And we don't find that in our system today. We find what we see on the right-hand side, which is from my research. The red dots are people in central office, and the blue dots are principals in one educational system. And in that system, you see that among principals, there's not a lot of connections, and among central office, there's not a lot of connections, but there's especially a disconnect between those groups. And if we want educational organizations to start to be able to teach kids to high standards, to teach new, diverse ways of learning to new types of students in their classrooms, we have to allow them the opportunity to learn together and to spread ideas and practices to make that happen. But we can change this through policy. We have, through the Every Student Succeeds Act, the opportunity to create new measures in our accountability systems that gets at these kinds of issues around the conditions, around trust and collaboration and the working conditions. Not just to blame people for what's going on in schools, but find ways to readjust our resources, reallocate them to create conditions or to develop leaders that can create those conditions to bring about change. But we can't stop there, and we don't often talk about the underlying systems of schools. But this is a critical piece of the story of school failure. So this is a map of Milwaukee, but it could be a map of almost anywhere across the country today. And what you see on this map through using GIS mapping tools is that the dots are the places where we find schools that we call failing. But what you see is the red areas are the areas that are high concentrations of poverty. And those same areas have high concentrations of Latino and African American students. And so we start to focus on school failure without understanding the underlying conditions that exist in those communities. The trauma that exists, the mobility among students, the resource inequities. And so in doing so, we haven't addressed the underlying problems that we have to get at. But we can change this through policy. We can actually incentivize responses of communities in regional areas to collectively respond to these problems. We've created through policy, or we've at least aggravated some of these situations by the artificial boundaries we've put around schools and school districts. And we can change this through policy by incentivizing groups to actually break down those boundaries or to work across them, allowing students to move across them and allowing teachers to learn across them. So I'm going to challenge you today to leave here and to think about the story of Horton. And to think about how if we stick with the simple solutions, we're never going to solve this problem of school failure. And that we really need to think about the context and the complicated layers of the system through policy so that we address both the system of educators and the system of schools. We allow the conditions to be created in our educational communities that allows teachers, counselors, administrators, central office staff to learn new ways of teaching and learning. And also that we break down the inequities in our system, we reduce the segregation that exists. And only through addressing these complex layers will we see success. Thank you.